is an elected member of New Jersey Watercolor Society and Baltimore Watercolor Society. And we're glad to have her back again with us. Emily, say hello.
Thank you very much. So I'm pleased to be back here. I was looking through my stuff and I realized that I did a demonstration here probably 10 years ago. I think it was the first one that Richard Haynes filmed, and it was with a table and the mirror and all that. So we've come into a new age, but I have to apologize and thank John and his team, because I moved things around by working this way and caused all sorts of havoc this morning with technical.
That's fine. That's not very bad.
Thank you. So what I was going to do, I do a variety of work. I do landscape, I do urban things. I just had a big show of all my urban work. I do still lifes. Some of you know I post these Friday flowers on Friday often. And I wasn't sure what to demo, and then Anne Marie said to me, you know, could you do something about we've had a lot of landscapes, can we do something about still life and composition and all that? So it threw me into a little different head.
It's not really on.
Now everyone hear me? Okay. So in demoing this still life, it's very interesting because, and some of what I say may be repetitive. I see some of my students here, whatever. But whether you're painting a still life, a landscape, a figure, it really is all the same thing. What you're painting is shapes and the relationships between them. And people get all off-put by the objects that they're painting, even in a landscape. And that's one of the things that I really want to work on today, is talking about shapes and how they relate, and the compositional elements. Okay. Also, the other thing that I've been kind of in my head struggling with or thinking a lot about is watercolor as craft or as magic, and where they intersect, right? I see these beautiful, and not to, I mean, they're gorgeous, but photorealistic elements, and sometimes I think I'm always awed by them, but when I sit there and try to do something that's that detailed, I'm like, to me, it doesn't have the magic for me to do. And I'm always amazed at watercolor. I feel like if I sit there and I'm working and then all of a sudden something appears, and I didn't do it, you know, and that to me is the best feeling. And I think to get there, you have to learn what the materials do and then let them do it. So in other words, if you learn as much as possible about the way your brush holds water, the kind of marks it makes, the way your colors mix, and then you can like put in a structure and stand back and it happens. People always say to me, I want to paint more loosely. Well, loosely really requires a lot of planning, because it's the way it's a knowledge of the way the paint goes down and what happens. So it's like doing scales or things like that. There's warm-up involved. I have some notes just to make sure I cover things. So with that said, I'm a big, my students tell you a thing about, did you do your thumbnail? Did you do your thumbnail? So preparing for this demo, I did a bunch of thumbnails. And tell me if you can't see, right? I did vertical and horizontal. I was playing with all different objects. And then last night, not to say I didn't do my homework, right? I drew it. But then I realized that as I'm drawing it and doing my thumbnails, there's a lot I couldn't teach you. So I decided, and also I'm in a different position now. So I'm putting this aside, but if I get in trouble, I have a drawing. I always said that Julia Childs had it really wonderfully, because she would bake a cake, and during the commercial break, you know, she'd slop in the eggs, and during the commercial break, she'd put it aside and pull a beautiful cake out of the oven, right? And I can't do that in this particular. The demo that I have a handout about a landscape demo I did, and that I'm a little more able to do it. So here was my thumbnail, and one of the things I always tell my students is to do a thumbnail in a box. And the reason is, if I've done something and it doesn't work, I can change the box. Or if I want to see what this looks like as a vertical, I can simply change the box. Can you see now?
Yes.
Okay. So if you can't see, someone's got to yell. right? So that's a big thing. The other thing that I tell students all the time is my best learning for watercolor comes from doing sketches. And again, I'm not sure if you could see the sketchbook.
Open the book.
Open it, okay. But because it's looking at shapes and it's practicing that skill, right? If you just sit down with the objects and try to create a painting, a lot of times you've missed the mark. So my first thing will be I'll do a thumbnail and I'll explore. And a lot of what I'm exploring, and you can see this, is the relationships between these objects. I sometimes have my students do something I call an etch-a-sketch drawing. And I have give them a big fat marker, a Sharpie, and I say go around and do a drawing of what's in front of you. And the one caveat is you always have to go back to the border somehow. You see what I'm doing? It's with pencil, but I do it with a big fat Sharpie. And one of the things that does, almost inevitably, I have wonderful compositions from students because it attaches everything to the sides. So I have these big shapes that are very interesting. Right now I like this better than my thumbnail, but I'm gonna ignore that and plow through, right? So that's what I wanna emphasize. So after I do my thumbnail, then I very loosely, and you can see I was getting antsy waiting, so I did a little bit of this, but I very loosely and lightly put my composition down. But you can see I didn't sit there and draw things perfectly because I don't want to be wedded. If I draw this flower and it's right, then, and it's in the wrong place or the wrong size, then I'm going to be very tempted not to start over or not to move it. So I do this very lightly, and I like when I hold the pencil to use my entire arm. I don't always paint standing up. Sometimes I paint sitting down, but I want to give it that kind of flexibility. So now that I've kind of penciled in this very light thing, now I'm going to paint. Now I'm going to do a more detailed drawing. I always say that painting plein air, and I consider this to be plein air, right? Because I'm painting what's in front of me, is like painting without a net a little bit. And it's a challenge, right? But you see, when I'm drawing a flower or something here, I'm not necessarily drawing the flower. I'm drawing a group. I'm drawing a big shape, and I'm trying to go a little darker than I usually do so you could see. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay. And one of my big expressions is paint what you see, not what you know. So again, if you'll be in much better shape if you say, I am painting this shape, and what does this shape look like, and what are the outside contours, than if I say, oh, here's a flower with petals, right? Because if I say, here's a flower with petals, I'm liable to do
I'm going to move
this.
the camera. Just keep going.
Okay, so I really am looking at shapes again, and in terms of the difference between working from reality and working from what's a photo, it is a really huge difference. And if I were going to have done a demo of a landscape from a photo, what I was going to show you is how different my paintings end up from the photos, right? Again, my students hear me say, if it's a wonderful photograph, if it's an absolute perfect photograph, great, blow it up, put it on the wall, and you're done, like why paint it? So my whole thing is that I want to add something to it in a way that brings in something. And again, the other thing is it doesn't have to be totally accurate. It has to be believable, right? So no one is going to buy this group of flowers. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to find spring flowers in this time of year. But all I could find were poinsettias, and I really wanted something with more color. Okay, so now I'm painting, and if you'll notice, in the same way I was talking about the etch-a-sketch drawing, I tend to be going from object to object, right? And not lifting my pencil a lot. because I like to see the connections between those things, all right? So if I do this properly, what I'm going to end up doing is painting it, drawing it twice, once with the pen and a pencil, once with my pencil, and then another time with the paintbrush, right? And I can also make modifications, and that's where the looseness comes in. But I do have this. Now, one of the caveats I have is when people paint objects, they tend to know they're sitting on a table, so they paint them all like in a line. And sometimes they say, should I draw on the table? I like to look a little bit down. That's one of the reasons I'm standing today, but I could have done it if I had a higher chair. Because what's really important, again, to me, and I'll show you as I draw, as I pencil it in now, is the relationship between the objects is just as important. I'm reminded of an essay I read that said, read something like, my fourth grade teacher was right. Margins are really important because you can write a beautiful essay and without margins, you can't read it, right? It doesn't, and the same way in a painting, the white spaces are really important. So I'm moving some of these cherries to make a better composition, but what's really important to me are these spaces and these shapes, and they look interesting. One little interesting way to check my composition, and this, I'm back to my thumbnail, right, is to take my thumbnail and draw it in quarters and look and say, are these interesting shapes, right? Are the spaces and the shapes and the amount of activity a little different in each quadrant? And if not, maybe I need to thrust something in. If something, is totally like, if those flowers had all fallen in that quadrant, I would have probably, moved some flowers into that quadrant. But it's a really good, handy way to check your compositions. Okay? Any questions at all, please yell. So I'm using my setup that I use for plein air, okay?
Excuse me, just bring the screen forward just a bit to get that light.
Okay.
I was washing out your colors over there.
Okay. Not that I have colors yet, right?
Well, no, what I meant
Right.
was that the whole screen is getting washed out from the lighting.
So I am putting in some of my shadows now, because I couldn't do that earlier, the lights were not on. But the shadows also serve a really important function, because the shadows connect the objects to each other and also the objects to the ground, right? So, like, you'll see it in a minute when I get this shadow. They're going the other way from the drawing I did yesterday of these objects. So, again, that's why, back to my, and so, a lot of times I'll have students who will take and try to, they'll be working on a still life, and instead they'll take their camera and take a picture and look at their picture. And it's not like there's some rule, but what happens is you see the camera's distinction, not yours. And one of the interesting things about the way the way you see is you see things, your focus is different, right? Especially the cameras we have today on our phones, which are great because you can always take pictures for possible still lifes. I'm always in the car on the bridge and I'm suddenly taking pictures, and my honey says to me, "What are you taking a picture of?" He said to me the other day, "You take all these pictures and when do you look at them?" And I said, "I paint from them." And he goes, "Oh." Then it was okay, So now, see, I'm seeing when I put in these shadows that I want to move this picture further back, and because I only had done a light rendition, I'm fine with that, right? I'm not. So.
What did you wipe the paper?
Kneaded eraser. Kneaded eraser, and that's the only kind of eraser I use on watercolor paper. I think the other erasers tend to wash out, tend to destroy the tooth of the paper and do all sorts of not nice things. So don't get in the habit of never using the eraser on the back of your pencil, and if you have one, and then also the white erasers are okay, but not nearly as good. All right, so again, and I'm modifying all the time because painting and drawing is all about relationships, right? So the relationships between the objects are what make things work, right? And that's, again, you're not painting a single object. I'm going to go out here because when I mat this, I might move it over a little. I brought a mat for that other drawing, and I didn't realize that the block was smaller. So, but you see how this line connects to this, to this, to this, to this, right? So I'm leading the viewer's eye, right? And I don't necessarily have to fill every corner. I put this here because I wanted my viewer to move this way. I probably need something there, and I may do that with a little bit of splatter or something. There's a lot of symmetry here, so maybe I'll move this way, put some cherries here. Incidentally, these cherries are fake. I don't usually like working from fake stuff, but I had a student who said to me, I don't know about paying for lessons if you have enough money to buy cherries at this time of year and whatever. So, all right, so this corner is kind of empty, but it's a nice balance for this, right? Any other questions? I have a beginning here, okay? And again, I'm going to improvise a little. If these cherries don't feel like they're in the right position, I'll move some of them. But you see, I'm not drawing each cherry necessarily, okay? I'm drawing the shape of all of them. And the shadows, so this is the only place. And one of the problems always is that, you know, I'm eager to paint. And I want to get painting, and you probably want to see me start painting. But if the drawing isn't right, no amount of good painting will save a bad composition or a bad painting. And so it's kind of important to resolve a lot of your problems. As I said, I said maybe I'll deal with this later in a different way, but I know that, and I know it's doable, right? That's just shadow lines. Gets you going in, nothing is stopping, no tangents to the paper, right? Because if you have two things just touching, it's not as easy. All right, so I think I'm okay.
Could
All
I
right,
ask a question?
please,
Would
please,
you,
please.
if you were just doing this for yourself and not for us, would you be drawing lighter lines, not such dark lines?
Maybe. It depends what my mood is, but I do tend to draw fairly dark. If I did it and I wanted to lighten it like this, I can. But it kind of gives me a certainty about it, right? And the lines kind of disappear, right? And I also believe very strongly in letting the viewer in on what I'm doing a little bit. Now I'm thinking I may move this up a little. And so I'm going to make sure I have the mat. I made this line just roughly, but I think when I mat it, usually I work edge to edge, but there's some buds here.
What kind of paper are you using?
So this is, I often work on Fabriano. This happens to be Arches, the orange one, the rough one. And actually for still lifes, I really like it. It kind of catches the water, and so that's what I decided to go with today. I don't know what about the tooth kind of catches things. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that it's a little too aerial, right? So I'm going to move it. Now that's the other thing I want to talk about is shadows. Shadows have perspective, okay? So again, if I'm doing, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Right? If these were all the same size objects, they're going back, right? The shadows, or if they're polka dots on a table, this is perspective. And shadows fall in that same perspective. So what some people forget is that this shadow is much narrower. You know, this one's more overhead than that one. So you have to watch that when you're doing something. Also is the perspective of the shadow and how the shadow fits in, and I love this shadow, which I didn't know was going to be here. Okay. So you see they're getting shallower, my shadows, as they go back a little bit. All right? Start painting. So everyone says, what do you paint first? I am a slob. And so my yellows always get to be a mess. Now, if you'll see, I'll bring this to the camera. All right, this is my palette. I like to paint in a travel palette rather than a big, sometimes I'll take a butcher block and put under it to have more mixing area. The reason I like to paint with this palette is because it's the same palette I paint with outdoors, indoors, when I'm demoing. So I get to know it so well, I can dip my brush in without thinking about the color. So I am, as I said, I'm a little bit of a slob, and my yellows get really dirty. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is these are Holbein paints. I have my supply list over there. And the Holbein paints, while they're not running, they're like toothpaste. I just filled them with fresh paint, but my paints are always like this, right? So if they start to get a little dry, I just squirt some more. So they really feel like toothpaste, and I don't have to work really hard. Again, that's the thing I was talking about using the qualities of the paint and not having to work real hard to create it. So I'm going to start with my lemons because my yellows, and I don't always do that. Sometimes I'll just start with what appeals to me. But one of the reasons I'm starting with these is because I know that my paints might get dirtier, and so if I have some of this down, it's easier, right? Real practical. The other thing you'll see is when I'm painting the lemons, if I really look carefully, especially something about these fluorescent lights, the shadows look kind of greenish, but food does not look good. Things with a greenish shadow. And usually, under like a warmer light, you'll see that the shadows don't look green. They look almost orange, right? So those are some of the things that I'm
Marilyn,
painting.
what colors are you using?
So I think I'm using New Gamboge and a little bit of cadmium red light, okay? But that's one of the few times when I will use a specific color without going into like the shadows. Usually I paint the shadows at the same time, but in this case I'm not going to do that. And so I'm going to get in some of my yellows all over the place, and then I'll go back and do other colors. And you asked me about, I forgot what I was going to say. So I'm going to go in and, again, I put a lot of colors in a lot of places right now, right? Just to kind of find my place, and because I have those on the, but I'm going to flit around because everything I do influences everything else I do. And that's a really important concept. So if I'm painting something, it looks different against the white than it will against whatever color ends up there. So that said, I'm not going to wait to do my shadows. I'm going to work on them at the same time. And some people make a mistake. So I wish you could see my palette at the same time, but let's see if I can do this a little bit. All right, so can you see my palette,
Yes.
right? So I pick colors that play well together. And when I'm painting, I try to put a bunch of those colors on the palette. I don't mix a homogeneous puddle, right? I mix a lot on my brush and and I'm gonna pick a nice bold shadow. I'm gonna pick a little bit of purple. People say, do you see that in there? Well, not particularly for these lemons, but it's a compliment, and so it's very nice that way. And if I'm lucky and this is still wet, like here, a little bit of the yellow from the lemons will hit the, right? So they end up, all right, now I'm not going to do all, well, I guess I will do my shadows all kind of at the same. It's kind of reverse that I'm doing my shadows first, but to me these are just big important shapes, okay? So, and you'll notice, you know, I always have my paints on the right because I'm right-handed. That way I don't drip across, even though I love drips. But So now I'm taking a little bit of, I guess this is quinacridone rose and a little bit of alizarin crimson, and I'm gonna put in some of these cherries. And you can see that I'm using, and now I added a little bit of blue to it too, right? And I'm using my brush to create these things, right? And again, as much as you can, I say I'm a lazy painter, so as much as you can use your brush and your tools to create the shapes, the better. Now, that said, the other thing I use a lot, you won't see me blotting the paper, okay? I use water and the way water runs, because it's just unique to watercolor, and you might as well use what it is that medium is about, right? So I use the water, and in doing so, I'm using the bead, right, to do this. And then if I feel like, oh, it's just too loaded, I'll just dry my brush with, and take a thirsty brush and pull it up. So, and I'm going all over the painting. Now, this is a little different than if I did a landscape, because if I did a landscape, I would look at what was common to everything, and I would paint that first. So, in other words, if the sky were blue, I might paint that blue sky first, and have it come down and put the trees on top of it, because the trees are green and the trees have blue in them. So, but because these are flowers and they have distinct colors, I'm not oops. I said I don't blot. Now you caught me on camera blotting.
I'll edit it out.
You can always do things like that, right? I mean, there's no rule. And you can always learn. And again, the other thing I want to say is I was looking at some of the videos of previous demos and when I was thinking of doing a scene, and I was laughing because, one demo says, oh, you always put the wash over everything, and another demo, everyone has their own way of painting. There is no right or wrong. And it's important to understand that. Again, it's good planning. It's how your eye moves, there's certain things. You don't want your eye to get stuck. You don't want something to, but in terms of how you put things down or how you start, some people go dark to light, different things. These are all my methods and they work for me. And I learned too. I had recently fallen in the trap of, I fell in love with a tube of, I think I got a free tube of opera red, and then I was listening to, was it Joel Papadix? He said, if you have opera red, give it to your best friend or your worst enemy, because it's fugitive. And I went like, oh my God. So I got rid of it, but
But now they fixed it.
That's why you gave
no.
it to me?
Yeah, right. That's why it's in here. No, they didn't fix it. You look at, so you should learn to look at tubes of paint. And every manufacturer, I use Holbein. Here's another nifty, I'll do a little commercial. I bought this thing called a paint tube organizer online. And so I have all my tubes, but each tube, so I use Holbein, and each tube on it had, of any color, any artist. So one of the things, like as I'm teaching, I'm showing someone something and I grab their cerulean blue and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not cerulean blue. And they say, yes it is, and they show me the tube and I realize it's not Holbein, it's a different brand and the color looks different, right? So that's also something to know. Now this shadow I hadn't put in, but it will definitely have the green of the water and the greens in it, right? So it's important to know your materials and understand that different manufacturers, the same color, if it could be called whatever it is, you look and there's a formula on it, there's a number on it, and that number is really about what's in it. It has numbers and it has a number of ingredients. And so it's often best to pick the ones with the fewest ingredients. And see that little, that's a nice thing, that's a happy accident, but when the shadow and the object of the shadow kind of mix. Okay. And I have second chances here. Everything I painted, most of it, I'm going to go over again. So, so now I'm taking and doing, so this is a yellow ochre, a little yellow on it. I have a color that my students all laugh at. I call it palette schmutz. It's usually a dark color that's left from everything else. But I use a lot of, again, by choosing colors that play well together, right? Then I use them interchangeably a lot of times, right? It's all very pale and weak right now, but I think that's also because of the lights, we'll see. Now, if you're painting outside, everything's going to change every time, you know, the light changes. So you have to catch really quickly the lights. I've forgotten which flowers these are. It's really hard to paint and talk. So,
You're doing a wonderful job.
well, thank you. So, and you know, it almost doesn't matter with some of these exactly what flower it is there, right? It's the sense of it. So there's a great freedom between not working from a photo, right? Because I'm the one that's making up the composition, and I'm the one that's making the decisions, not the camera. And again, I try to emphasize that even when you're working from a photo, there's a way to do that, right? And it's just important to work from the composition, not the, I moved the still life so many times, I'm not sure which flower's which. Any questions? This is a carnation.
Oh, the brush.
Yes.
It obviously doesn't bother you that it bends.
Oh, I love that it
With the cherry.
bends. So again, the brush that I use, I don't have a scrap of paper, I use my sketchbook, right? I love these brushes. These are the low Cornell. So you dip them in water. Well, it's a little bit too much water, right? And the water is in here, and then you dip in the paint, and it's feeding the paint. And so all the ways that I can move the brush give me, it's like a dancing brush. That to me is the most exciting part, that it moves. You know, I'm not working with a pencil. I'm working with a brush, and so that's what I want to emphasize. Now these little berries, I know they're white, but the bouquet I wanted to buy had red berries, just like that, so I'm gonna put my little red berries. So, you know, it gives me a really fine line, and it also, you notice I haven't really changed brushes. Sometimes I can paint almost a whole painting with it, because it could go big, it could go small, it could go. So was the comment because you thought that if it bends, it doesn't give you?
Well, I have a similar brush. I think it's made by Chief Joe's.
Uh-huh.
And it has a fine, it's thick like that, and it has a point, which I like, but it annoys me when it bends. But you're making the best use of it.
So I think that the trick is to take your brush and just use it and see what it does, right? Let it tell you how to use it. And then you'll know what it's right for, right? It might not be right for every situation. But, so I'm adding more yellows here to give these more dimension. I'm not drawing every single piece. It's in the back too. It's really kind of the focus, but it's also, you know, when you look at flowers, you don't say, oh, how many petals do each of those have, right? That's not the thing. And I think I bought this because I love these little purple and yellow, purple flowers with yellow centers. Now I have some white flowers in there, which I actually didn't put in. I'm not exactly. But I'm going to work on a background at the same time. So I'm going to take out my big flat brush if I can find it. Here it is. Okay. This isn't my biggest flat brush. So here are two brushes I love. I can do an entire painting with maybe a rig or two. I'm going to show you my selection of brushes. These are, I have other brushes, but these are my favorite brushes, right? And really, this and this are, I can do a whole painting. So my house painting brush here, I'm going to start to put in a background a little bit at the same time. And I hate when, I shouldn't say that, I have students in the room. To me, one of my pet peeves is when someone finishes a painting and says, what should I do with the background? Well, it's probably too late now if you haven't thought about it, you know, in advance. So I want to get in there with some of this before. And you'll notice I painted right over the shadows. That's another little peeve or thing I have is shadows have to be darker than what they're on. And so if you paint a really neat shadow and then paint around it, it doesn't belong. Shadows can relate the objects to each other and to the ground they're on. So, and I can use the brush. I'm not really doing a tabletop here, but I'm using the, whoops, I got yellow in there. Okay, go with it, right? I can go with, so this is how I'm gonna paint some of these white flowers, is by painting around them, right? So I've just created the illusion of some white flowers, right? And again, my background isn't the same everywhere. And again, it's a shape. It's helping me see the shapes of the still life. So again, in here, let's switch it a little bit. Sometimes, and I'm being kind of bold and taking some big chances here because I just want to.
Do you usually paint with the painting more vertical than horizontal?
Yes. I mean, I will work on a table, but I'll always have like a 4-inch thing under to incline it, right? Because then you're working with the water.
Let it flow.
Yeah, and people say, well, doesn't it drip? Well, if it drips, if you know my paintings, I love drips. But even if not, you know, the paint will only go where the water is. So it won't necessarily drip. You can see how much it's pooling there, and I can just wake it up. It doesn't really drip until it reaches its saturation point. Now I have a bad blossom there, which I'll deal with. But in a sense, I've created a few more shapes with my background, right? And so it's kind of created, I'm going to look at it critically. I'll have to let this dry. Again, if I'm going to give you, I said there are no rules, and I'm going to give you some rules. And one of them is never go back into the paint when it's really, really wet. You either have to, that's the other reason I paint all around a painting. You either want to wait till it's totally dry or when it's soaking wet, all right? Because otherwise you get blossoms. And also you can't tell. So the other realization I've had recently with students is one of the reasons they'll look at something and as they're painting it, the top is drying and so it's getting lighter and the bottom gets dark, is still wet and it's darker, and they'll go, oh, I have to go back over that to make it match. Well, and they end up with a mess because again, as it's drying, it's getting lighter, and so you go back later, right? I mean, these lemons, well, that's kind of an orange lemon, but all right, we'll go with it. So how is my time? How long do I have for this?
It's 3 o'clock now. You have till 3:30.
Oops, okay. Time flies, I didn't realize it was, okay. So soft and hard edges are another tool that I have to me, right? And the only other kind of real rule is that I can't get my whites back, right? So my whites or my lights are really important, right? Because that's not something that I can get again. And now I might let these shadows go into the, okay. So I got to deal with this cherry bowl. All right, it's only a demo. So again, there's a dark shape in here, and it's the inside of the picture, but it's just a dark shape, right? And that's kind of important, but I don't want it to be totally isolated. So there's this paint on the rim. So I'm using the stuff that's in front of me to do what I wanted to do, right? And again, this brush can go. So I think, you know, back to that comment about the brush bending or whatever, I think a big mistake people make is they sit down to paint, and that's when they're using their brush. Like, I think doodling with a brush is a really good way to learn what your tools do. You know, you wouldn't start, someone wouldn't give you a power drill and you start power drilling without having tried it on something else, right? I don't know if that was a good analogy, but I don't know what I just did. That's the wrong color, so I'll just do that. Again, John, you edit out all the blotting or my students will yell.
At this rate, I'm gonna have 3 minutes to work with.
Oh, thanks. Just threw me under the bus, John. Thanks. It's a better color.
Did you ever mention one of your mentors is Charles Reed?
Yeah.
You did mention that?
No, I mean, it's funny because I went to several workshops of his, but I didn't really know him when I started painting in this manner, you know, and then I fell in love with his work. I always loved the story that, you know, he had all these groupies and people would go from workshop to workshop and they would use these they would use a palette. He had this palette that was hand hammered that he buys in Scotland or whatever, or Wales. Someone makes it for him, and the people that would come to his workshops often had these palettes. You know, they'd go and have them made, and you know, it was funny because they had these palettes, but they didn't paint like Charles Reed. And you know, I think there's this thing about a magic brush or a magic whatever, and you think you can. I think Charles Reed has influenced me, but so has Tim Saturnoff, so has a lot of people, Mel Stabin, just a lot of people. And I think that one of the really useful things to do is to take from all these people what it is that helps you and is useful to you, right? And different people have different things to give. You know, I know Tim Saturnoff is doing a workshop here, and I took a workshop with him at Art Students League, and I love his work, and I said to him, you know, you're so giving. He's a very generous person. And I said, aren't you sometimes afraid that, you know, there'll be a bunch of Tim Saturnoff imitations floating around? And he said, yeah, but there'll be imitations, you know. And I don't think you can paint like someone. You can try, but I think you have to paint like you. And in general, unless you, it's when you paint like you that the paintings have life, right?
Your contour drawing, like keeping the pencil on the paper and then connecting the shadows, is pure, at least it seems to be pure Charles Reed.
Yeah, actually, that came from, in college, I had a Barry Schachtman, a figure drawing teacher who that was his thing. I mean, we worked from the model, we worked from skeletons and musculature, and he was so much so that way. And it was really interesting because I was at a plein air event and I met this guy, and he also did a lot of things with, people say I kind of forced the perspective, and he did this thing with forcing the perspective. And I didn't realize that piece of where I got that from until Len Brower, who's a really wonderful plein air painter and won lots of awards. And I noticed he went to WashU, where I went, and he said to me, oh yeah, that was from Barry Schachtman. And I went like, yes, that's where it's from, you know. So a lot of the paintings that I'm doing now, if anyone's seen, are these urban scenes. I have one there of a snow scene, but where I'm using a lot of dripping and darker colors, and colors aren't as separated as they are in this. I need to get those cherries richer and darker. No questions?
We're watching.
Okay.
The space in the bowl of cherries,
Yeah,
where it's white, are you going to fill that in?
not over here, I'm not, I don't see it.
So
These
this
parts
one-
are gonna be, these are gonna be the reflections on a few of the cherries. So again, and that's an important piece, you know, like I look at watercolor as sculpture, like working in clay. And when you work in clay, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. As working in stone, and you're chiseling out the spaces, right? You're chiseling out the darks, as opposed to like an opaque medium, like oil or acrylic, where you're creating the, you know, it's almost like you're working on an armature. And so what you're doing is, I'm sorry, it's hard.
Negative painting, is that?
No, but it's building something up, right? And I think of watercolor as chiseling away. Now, the other thing I'm aware of is there's a water line in the vase. And another thing, and again, this comes from observation, right, is the stems kind of move over, they're refracted, right? So that's an important piece. And the other thing is how they form. Don't have to know which stem goes to which flower, but they form shapes here too, and that's another piece. So watercolor does a wonderful job on glass and on water because it is the same material, right? So again, I forgotten, I would have put a little bit of crayon here and probably preserved some of the letters on it's one of those ball jars. But again, I'm looking at the shapes that exist, and the walls of the glass kind of create a shape. So, okay. I didn't realize, for me, that working from a still life is a hard demo because I can't have planned everything in advance. Put some of these greens. So again, I had drawn some of it, and now I'm kind of seeing what it needs. So one of my favorite colors is this Holbein color, and it's called green. I'm going to do it here, greenish yellow. But it's it mixes like a yellow. It's a great color because it makes greens. I don't really have I have sap green on my palette, and I have greenish gold. And most of the greens I make are built around that. I'm adding to those. Like it needs some punch in here, you know, so I'm constantly not only responding to what's on the ground in front of me, but also to what the painting needs. There's a shadow that's been cast by the green kind of takes over my palette when I have it, so. Right, and then the other thing I want to do is when I move my brush, I move it in the direction, right? You notice when I painted the lemons, the brushwork was in the direction, almost as if I'm painting on the figure. I find that a lot with figure painting when I do that. It's almost sensual the way you're dragging your brush. It's almost as if you're dragging it across the model, right? Across whatever plane you're creating. So those are some of the fallen leaves I just feel like it needed. Right, I'm constantly looking at the painting and saying, what does the painting need? This lemon, which looked so bold, is now wimpy, right? So we're gonna go and give it another, but when I give it more dimension, right? By not painting the whole thing in, but going over the contour of the lemon. Right? So, let's see where I am. I think I need some purples in there, and there are some purples in that flower, so we'll go back in. So what I put in changes the things I've painted, right? That's a really important concept to understand, that whenever I add something to something, it changes everything else in the painting, right? So by putting some darks here, then I have to say, well, does that work? And where else do I need darks? Or is it too much? Or does it bring my eye in? You know, and those are the questions I'm constantly asking myself. You know, it's kind of like a magician, and you're creating an illusion, right? And it's how much do you need to put in? How much do you need to create that illusion? Dark here. So I have till 3:30. Okay. I have till 3:30 to ruin this painting.
Well, you know what Bill Stapleton said, right?
What?
It's why work on a painting for 2 hours when you can fail at once?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm the same. I feel that. So I just bought that red that I put down. It has a lot of quinacridone magenta in it. I'm trying to find a substitute for that opera color. And I look, this is a real stable color.
And why did you get rid of the opera?
It's transitory. It's very unstable. It will fade. So again, the whole line, they have asterisks on them to say how, I think it goes from 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, and I looked at it and it was 1 as opposed to the magenta is 3. So again, I'm not happy with my cherries here. Let's see if I can save them.
You don't have to say every cherry.
No, I'm not saying every cherry, but I save them. I just, the whole general thing, I don't want to paint every cherry, but I'm cherry picking.
They look delicious to me. I wish I
They're
had
a little, I don't know, they're a little not as, the edges are not as distinct of the whole thing. Again, you know, you look at one thing and then it's like, well, does that matter? But it's, unfortunately, compositionally, I was off here after everything I sent you, because this is front and center, and I realized that, and it shouldn't have been.
It's not centered, it's not.
No, but this way it's centered. So maybe I'll just add something here to kind of carry it so it's not so isolated there, and I think that helps a little bit. So I had a judge in a plein air event say that he thought painting plein air was very brave. He is a plein air, John McDonald, very well-known plein air artist, and he said it's very brave. He thinks that plein air has a 50% failure rate. And I was so happy to hear that, because I thought it was just me, you know, but I think that's true, and I think that's the difference, again, especially when you're painting in a transparent medium. Because if you're painting in an oil or whatever and you don't like the way it's working, you simply put another layer on it, or you ditch the canvas and put another painting on it. But the problem with watercolor, you just end up throwing out the paper, which is fine, you know, gives you a lot of nice test paper for other, to test colors and stuff, or do exercises, or practice your brush work. But you're more acutely aware of the fact that, and I think it's an important thing, that not every painting, oh, I got that black in the middle. All right, John, this part gets edited out. You know, how you get that. You know, so you end up with a lot of failures, and that's good. And you need those failures to have the successes. If you don't have the failures, what happens is you're not pushing yourself. You're just doing something that's easy, right? I always tell students in my class, I know you want something like to frame for the front hall, but, you know, if you want to become a better painter, take those risks. If you're taking a workshop, I firmly believe that you should be really invested in learning what someone's teaching, and that might mean coming away with a really bad painting because it's out of your safe zone, right? But you're going to learn something more from it. So that said, I think I'm learning a lot from this painting. It's not, it's just not nuanced. And again, it might be the amount of time and everything else. But I'm going to try to add some personality to it, and everyone knows that this is what I like to do.
Yeah.
I just splashed me. So one of the ways I add texture, and I like to do this in a landscape, I like to do this in a lot of things, is I'll cover an area that I want to protect, perhaps, or to get a direction to what I'm doing, right? Because I want this to kind of bring it forward in this direction. I did a painting like this in my studio, and I did these pears, this huge painting of pears, and one of my students said, yeah, but it's so messy, you know, new student to me said, yeah, but you know, why'd you mess it up? I have to wipe my face too. So, again, it's better to do this having the painting down. You know, I would take the painting and put it flat on the table to do this, but you wouldn't see it, so. Just adding some color and some texture and some nuance to different things. So what I like about this painting and what I don't like, right, as I'm looking at it, I like this bright orange, even though it was kind of unintentional, but it just gets my eye going. But I want to try to get myself going so that I follow it. They no longer quite look like lemons, and if I were in my studio, I would probably put a nice coat of yellow over some of that. But right now, it's going to do. Also, these fluorescent lights seem to wash everything out. Blame the lights. Always blame something, right? Yep. So, I'm seeing this white shape, and shouldn't be like a prominent white shape. So I want to kill it, and I want to kill it with, this is why I said about killing, right? And I'm killing it with kind of a general color because I don't want to. And then so I have handouts on the table, and there are different handouts. One is about classes I teach. I teach both in Demarest at the Art School at Old Church. That stuff you can find online, and I teach on Thursdays in my studio. I also have my Vermont. I teach at the Land Room. I'm doing this year 4 days because it was well received and people wanted more. So it's a 4-day class in Land Room, which is a beautiful place. So I have information about that. And I also have a supply list, just because I know people always say, well, what colors did you use? So it has my favorite colors. And if you're, so we're lucky enough to live in the area with Jerry's Art Supply, you know, a real art supply store. But a lot of my students up in Demarest only get their paints like from Blick and stuff. And they don't necessarily have a lot of Holbein, and they don't have a lot of this and that. So I created a basket, a teacher's basket online at Jerry's Artorama, which is the online version of Jerry's. It's not quite the same. And the nice thing about that is it allows you, you just could go to it and see I don't get anything from it. It just shows you what the colors are. You know, it's in your cart and then you can take it out or put it in or something. And if you have any questions about anything that I've covered or didn't cover or anything at all, my cards are there and you're welcome to email me. So I just added it needed some more heft, it needed some more darks. So those leaves don't exist here, but you know, they work.
I like the cherry.
So I think I'm gonna call it
Yes, call it a painting.
When
a
you're
painting.
done.
There are things I would do if I were, but right now, and I will put it in a mat so you can see the end product. I ruin more mats that way when I put a wet paint in, but I have one that's all fingered anyway, so. So, easel with this. I just matted my signature off, but do that again.
Nice.
And that's Sydney.
Can we call it?
Thank you very much.